So I'm here on the third leg of my plastic pollution conversation tour of the Pacific Rim. My book, Plastic Ocean, was recently published in Japanese, so I went to Tokyo. And there I had a couple of events. We then went to Hong Kong, and now I'm here in Australia, where I originally built my research vessel in Hobart 17 years ago. The reason I'm doing this, not so much because I have a book, but because this issue is, I believe, urgent. Tim mentioned the fact that he thought plastic pollution may rival climate change in the effects it's having on our planet, and I think he's right. In terms of the number of animals killed right now by plastic, I think that exceeds the number of animals killed by climate change. This plastic age that we live in snuck up on us kind of surreptitiously. We have our food delivered in it, we wear it, the interior of our cars are made out of it, the interior of our homes are made out of it. It's just surrounding us, it's part of our lives. But we've never really had that plastic conversation. We've never really stepped back and said, does it belong everywhere? Is it doing what we want it to do? It certainly made things convenient, but it's like that drug that you hear about that has all these side effects for the one benefit that you get. We're starting to see the dark side of plastic, the side effects, and that's what I'm here to talk to you about tonight. So I'm going to go ahead and fire up the computer and get into a discussion of the plastic plague in our beautiful ocean. So first, a disclaimer. I didn't discover the North Pacific subtropical gyre. That was known to the California Department of Fish and Game in the 1950s and 60s that there is a recirculating current in the North Pacific. This is from an article on the migration of albacore tuna that was published in 1961. So you can see from the arrows that there's a recirculating area here about halfway between Hawaii and San Francisco. That's the so-called Eastern Garbage Patch. But it wasn't the Eastern Garbage Patch in 1961, it was just a place in the ocean. Then in the Western Garbage Patch, you can see a recirculation there. That diagram depicts quite well the North Pacific subtropical gyre. You can also see that in the Alaska area, there's a counterclockwise current, which is a low pressure system. Now, today, government scientists have a new way of characterizing this area. They characterize it as a convergent zone for trash. And these two kind of red eyes here are the garbage patches, the Eastern Garbage Patch and the Western Garbage Patch. These are the areas that we're going to be discussing tonight. Now, this is not a trivial area. This area is huge. Just to emphasize how large the Pacific Ocean is, I put this slide in. You can see the continental United States is dwarfed by the size of the Pacific Ocean. Even the eastern part is bigger than the continental United States. So when we say that there's a place in the ocean that's filling up with our trash, we're not talking about a trivial area. This is an area as big as Western Europe, as big as twice the size of Texas, whatever comparison you want to make. This is an enormous area. Now, this atmospheric system, this high pressure system that creates the gyre, is depicted here in the work of James Ingram Jr. devoted his life to studying surface currents in the North Pacific, and he averaged the high pressure system over the North Pacific so that you can see how this system is created. What happens is air is heated at the equator, right? Hot air rises, okay? Where is it hot? It's hot at the equator. So the hot air rises at the equator. It's pushed toward the poles by cooler air rushing in to fill that void when the hot air rises. This H here corresponds to a peak of a mountain of air. That's the high pressure is actually the weight of the air. It's higher pressure because it's pushing harder on the surface of the earth because there's more of it. It has a weight, atmosphere has a weight pushing down. The H is the high. As that air descends, in the northern hemisphere it goes in a clockwise direction. That creates this North Pacific gyre. The force of the air pushing on the water is what makes the currents, all right? So in the southern hemisphere, the opposite effect occurs. The high creates a counterclockwise current. Now, the vessel that I used to study this area was built in Hobart, Tasmania, and launched in 1995. It's purpose designed right here in Sydney, Northern Beaches by Crowther. Locke Crowther designed it. His son Brett took over when Locke passed away and built this vessel with me, designed it, and we launched it out of Macquarie Wharf in Hobart in 1995. Lifted it up in a container crane, dropped it into the water, and christened it with 2 bottles of champagne. It's a catamaran. You got to have 2 bottles. It's got 2 bows. And we built it so it could sail to my home port in Long Beach, California, under a bridge that's 12 feet high. Now, how do you get a 70-foot mast under a 12-foot bridge? Well, you put a hinge right here, and you lower it down onto a cradle right there, so you're like Don Quixote tilting at windmills, and you go under that bridge. You also take the boom and lay it down on a crutch. This was all designed and fabricated by Toby Richardson and Ronnie Devine down at Richardson Devine Marine Constructions in Hobart. The mast affords a good vantage point for looking for marine debris, and we sailed right here in Sydney Harbor as our first mission, working with Karsten Matai at the University of Sydney, using a dredge to test sediments in Newcastle and in the harbor here. We were supported by Coast Care. We were the first Coast Care research voyage. It was organized by the current president of Surfrider Australia, Rex Campbell. And this is us being interviewed in the Gold Coast back in 1996. Now, I was a new skipper, as you can see there, all decked out. And we went to the town of 1770 up in Gladstone and had a representative from Surfrider on board, and he guided us through Seal Rocks, through the reef there. We dropped him off in 1770 and turned around and came back around dusk. Started to get dark. I didn't have proper charts of the area, and I ran that thing aground on Seal Rocks. Rex Campbell and his family was aboard. They had to be rescued by Gladstone Air Sea Rescue, and I nearly lost the vessel. Was the first of a couple of mishaps this vessel had. At first we thought maybe it wasn't such a good idea to be oceanographer and build your own research vessel and drive it around and get into trouble. If it's too much trouble, it's too much trouble. But we persevered. We had Gladstone Air Sea Rescue come out with a pump. We put the pump on board. They towed us in at 1 knot. We were virtually submerged. The only thing keeping us afloat was the airspace on the swim steps, the reverse transom behind the keel. That's what kept us afloat. We'd hold every single watertight compartment in the boat. And we were towed in. It took 12 hours to go 12 miles from Seal Rocks into Gladstone. But we rebuilt it. It took 9 months to rebuild it, the same amount of time it took to build it in the first place, and began doing oceanographic research. The main thing that we do is deploy what we call a manotrawl. It's a device for testing the surface of the ocean. It's like a manta ray. It has that wide mouth. It has the 2 wings corresponding to the fins of a manta ray, and it has a net coming out the back end of it. And it's a very good tool for finding out what's in the surface waters of the ocean. If you have a little wavelet breaking in front there, it gets caught by that hood, so you don't lose anything. In other words, what a scientist wants to know is what's really there. If we're saying that there's a problem with certain kind of pollution, we want to measure that pollution. We want to make sure that that measurement is accurate. And this device is one of the best for getting an accurate measurement of what is oceanographers call the neuston, or the surface layer of the ocean, down to about 20 centimeters. We drag this thing along very slowly, about 1 to 2 knots, and it has a long conical net coming out the end of it with the mesh of a cheesecloth. It's very fine mesh, 1/3 of a millimeter, and you have to drag it very slowly or you create a bow wave out the front pushing the stuff away. So drag it very slowly, very long net, and you get that collection bag at the end that's mounted on a tube. You unscrew the collection bag, and surprise, surprise, in a beautiful blue ocean, and believe me, the ocean is still beautiful and blue, as you all know, but when you start trawling it with one of these neuston nets and dump it out, especially if you're in one of these garbage patches, this is what the ocean has become. This is the new normal. This is what we call a shifting baseline. It's like the surface of the ocean could have been characterized in 1900 by how many different types of plankton were in it. Now we characterize it by how much plastic is in it, in addition to how much plankton is in it. And this quantity is absolutely astounding. And it has every kind of thing you can think of, from spacers for the oyster industry, these are tubes, to toys, to these little spherical pellets. Now, they've been called surfer pills, mermaid tears, nurdles, but they're actually plastic resin beads. That's the raw material of the plastic industry. That's what everything that's made out of plastic, the back of your chair, your clothes, the soap bottles, all those different things that have thermoplastic origin, meaning that the plastic is heated up, melted, and put into a mold or blown into a bag, start their life as one of those pellets. That's the raw material of the plastic industry. Now, as those pellets sit in the ocean, they do something problematic. They absorb pollutants. And as they do, they change color. This is one of them here. The longer they've been at sea, the more pollutants they absorb. That's a problem, because these pellets are what you make every kind of plastic out of. If it's happening to the pellets, it's happening to every broken little shard of plastics that's out in the ocean. It's a magnet, it's a sponge for pollutants. So the situation is this. We've got a sample, we take it back to the lab, we endeavor to determine how much plastic is in that sample by patiently sorting it under a dissecting microscope into plastic and plankton, natural materials and artificial materials. It takes about a week to do one of these samples. And once we've got it separated between the plastic and the plankton, we rinse it through a series of sieves, the same kind of sieves that a geologist would use to determine the grain size of sediments. Over on the left-hand side is 2 to 4 millimeters, then comes 1 to 2 millimeters, then 3/4 to 1 millimeter, 1/2 to 3/4, and 1/3 of a millimeter, the size of the mesh, to 1/2 of a millimeter. We do one more step, which is to separate the sample into the types of plastic that we find out there. And we've determined the types of plastic that we want to classify are styrofoam, that's foamed polystyrene, pellets, there's nurdles, the surfer pills, mermaid tears. Then comes the most common identifiable type of plastic, the packaging, the thin plastic films. Then the next most common identifiable type is the fishing line and the net fragments that have come unraveled. And then this is the most common type, which is miscellaneous fragments. We don't have any DNA way to identify these. If it was oil, the Coast Guard could do a fingerprint and come up with where the oil came from. They can't do that with plastic. And the reason, now, you know, a lot of people are going to think, well, here on the shore, we're finding a whole bunch of this polystyrene foam. Why aren't we finding it out in the deep ocean? The reason is that polystyrene is heavier than water. It only floats when it's got gas blown into it at the time of manufacture. And when that gas is blown into it, it makes cells. And those cells are narrow and very thin, and they break. And so when those cells break, the water floods in, it becomes waterlogged, and it sinks. So out in the deep ocean, we don't find a lot of that floating polystyrene foam. In terms of the color, we find very few bright colors. We think that's because they're attractive to birds and fish. 83 tan colored pieces, you know, just not a lot of bright colors, mostly whites and clears. We've been out there quite a few times, done this work, put that net out there. There's every one of those dots is a place where we've taken that net, put it out, pulled it in, taken that bag off, dumped it out, preserved the contents, taken it back to the lab, separated plastic and plankton, and gotten the result, okay? We can express that result in a number of ways. One way is to make the circle bigger when there's more plastic in it. So the larger circles mean that's a greater concentration of plastic. Well, you know, that's how we get analogies like twice the size of Texas. There's Texas, there's this garbage patch. So it's not really a scientific unit of measurement, the state of Texas, but that's not meaningless to say that it's twice the size of Texas. We can also show it by just changing the color of the chart and say that the redder it is, the more plastic is there, so you get a brighter color, so you shade it. And that also, you get the idea about how big this garbage patch is. Now, we went out there 3 times to this one particular place, the place where we found 6 times as much plastic as plankton in 1999. In 2009, we found 26 times as much plastic as plankton. And in the winter of 2008, we did it in the summer in 99. We wanted to go back in the winter and see if the season made any difference. Turned out to be worse. The plastic to plankton ratio was 46 to 1 in 2008 in the winter time, and it was 26 to 1 in the summer of 2009. So the only difference here that's kind of surprising is that the total count of plastics went down in 2009. And we think we know the reason. It's because these small particles of plastic respond to wind speed. If the surface of the ocean is rough, the waves are breaking, these little pieces of plastic get driven down below the surface and are not captured by our net. See, the weight went up even though the count went down. So what that means is there was more large pieces out there, but because it was rougher, the little pieces were down under the water. Now, if there's more big pieces, that means there's more of the stuff like this. This is the kind of stuff we pick up when there's net windrows that we transit. We go along these kind of cells that dredge up debris along this and leave it on the surface, and as we navigate along that, we can take a net off the bow and collect stuff. And we collect, this is the kind of stuff we collect out there in the garbage patch. Now, what that means is when you have a lot of big stuff, you have a lot of habitat. The deep ocean is historically completely devoid of stuff. It's water, okay? That's what's in the deep ocean. Water, plankton, and fish. Well, now the ocean is not just water, plankton, and fish. It's water, plankton, fish, and trash. And because there's trash out there, fish that normally couldn't hang out in the deep ocean can hang out there. Even a net provides a place for fish to hang out. Why? Because they're protected from predators. You see how clear the water is. A predator can easily see these fish, but these fish can dart around behind the net, and you know, a mahi-mahi or a tuna that's chasing after them will get stuck in the net and have to, you know, watch out. So they can play hide and seek with a big predator. So it's very attractive to a small fish to have all this trash in the ocean. It's also a big bummer for me to have all this trash in the ocean, because I have to get woke up in the middle of the night and cut it off my props. It's a navigational hazard. You know, the Coast Guard will publish a notice to mariners telling of navigational hazards in the coastal zone. If there's a log out there, they're going to tell you. If there's a big something or other floating out in the harbor, they're going to tell you. But there's no reporting going on for derelict fishing nets out in the middle of the deep ocean. No notice to mariners could possibly enumerate all these hazards to navigation that are out there, so you're just cruising along and you run into these things, you've got to cut them off yourself. When I say it's a new kind of habitat out there, I'm not just talking figuratively, I'm talking literally. The coral that's growing on these broken bits of plastic is actually like the same corals that are growing on the reefs in Hawaii. These are coral heads being manufactured on our trash. Here is another example of how much junk we can get going down one of these windrows. And if you look in this basket that's used to sort fish, that's a coral head there, that's a coral head right there. We're creating coral reef habitat, so we're getting coral reef fish, like the Hawaiian sargent, like the scrawled or scribbled filefish. If you look this fish up in a field guide, you're going to find that the field guide's going to tell you, if you're looking for this fish, you need to look at a coral reef up to 120 meters deep. If you're not going to find it in 3,000 meters of water like I found this one. But because there's surface habitat for these fish, we're now finding coral reef fish in the middle of the ocean. That's why I'm saying, even though it's really not a trash island, it's acting like a new coastline. It has the kind of habitat that you would have in the coastal zone. This fish is living in a coral reef habitat in the middle of the ocean. This is a new thing in history. This is a new way of looking at the ocean. We have to look at it as the last unexplored continent on Earth are these continents in the gyres, these habitats for our wayward trash. You get a frogfish out there. Now, frogfish is a chameleon of the ocean. They change colors. These are both frogfish, all right, the same species. One of them was behind a black buoy or something. The other one was by a mottled, different colored net or something. They'd lie in wait. They're lie-in-wait predators. They're just matching whatever the background is, and when something swims by, they lunge out and try to grab it. Well, this is the color of fish in the deep ocean. You have silvery on the bottom, so if you're looking up, it blends into the silvery, sparkling surface water. They're dark on the top, so if you're looking down, they blend into the deep, dark blue. Those are the two colors for tuna, swordfish, mahi-mahi. Basically, that's the color of a pelagic fish. Not, you know, infinite number of colors to match a background that doesn't exist. There's no, historically, any background out there. There's just the blue of the deep ocean. Now we got situations like this, where you have fish that look like they're sick, actually totally relaxed. This fish is sunning himself. It looks like a top of a barrel to a predator. It's only an inch of water over the thing, but it's happy to be there. It doesn't care. There's nothing going to come chasing it. It can live there for ages. It just looks like a barrel, you know. It's not going to be attacked because it doesn't look like a fish. And here's another habitat for fish, you know, a soap bottle, a little condo there. Here's affordable housing for fish, you know. They've got their little cafeteria up here with the algae. These are vegetarian fish, you know. This is a great place to live. You got shopping is right around the block, you know. There's no problem at all. Here's a black plastic trash bag. Again, a place to hide. Here's a caulking tube, what you'd use on your window or your bathtub, with a worm living right there on it. And you turn it around, it's a triggerfish bed and breakfast, you know. Plenty to eat there. And these things can really munch plastic. These triggerfish have really sharp beaks. Look what they can do to a soap bottle. I mean, they can tear that thing apart. So plastic is a lot like food. It's a lot like habitat. It kind of combines both of those things. Your Ziploc baggie, delicious. Yum, yum. Now, Dr. Hank Carson at the University of Hawaii in Hilo has done a study of debris that washed up on Camilo Beach. You might have seen my necklace, that's from Camilo Beach. You might have seen Tim Silverwood's display back here of sand from Camilo Beach, which is 90% plastic. Camilo Beach is also where a lot of bits of bottles and floats wash up. And what Dr. Carson did was he just took a random sample of all these things that washed up on Camilo Beach, and he went to the museum and got a sample out of the museum of the bite marks, and he matched up the bite marks to the plastic. Now, the reason why this matters is because plastic absorbs pollutants. It absorbs pollutants floating in the water. It's what you use to clean up an oil spill. The rags that people use to separate oil from water in their bilges. If you're a recreational boater, you know you get a rag when you go to the fuel dock that's going to absorb the fuel if you spill it. That's made out of plastic. If you got a bilge pad for your bilge so you can pump the water over without having a sheen on the surface of the ocean, that's plastic that separates oil from water. The oil sucks into the plastic. So it's a sponge for plastic floating in the ocean, plus anything that went into the plastic when it was manufactured starts leaching out. So it's a source and a sink for pollutants. Now, what Dr. Carson did was he got these bite marks and matched them up with the bite marks on the plastic, and what he came up with was, you know, in terms of these teleos, which means bony fish, all right? It's carnivorous teleos, and aves is birds. This is sharks and rays, and this is vegetarian fish. You're looking at quite a high percentage having matched up to the bite marks on that trash. About a third of what he was seeing on the beach, just randomly selected, is already being consumed by animals in the ocean. And the reptiles would be your turtles over here. A fairly high percentage of the stuff being consumed by turtles. Now, as far as the bird consumption issue goes, the poster child up until now, and we'll talk about who the new poster child might be, has been the Laysan albatross. And this is a big bird. This biologist's stomach, I don't think is any bigger than this 4-month-old chick's stomach. That's why I put this slide up there, so you could compare her stomach to this chick's stomach. This is a big bird. Albatross are big birds. Now, you won't be surprised then when I tell you that that one chick would have this in its stomach. This is the stomach contents of a 4-month-old Laysan albatross chick. The only thing natural in there are some squid eyes and beaks right here and some pumice right here. This is like that spray foam that you use. These are mayonnaise jar lids, that Kewpie mayonnaise, you know, that squeeze bottle mayonnaise, those red lids. There's some Coke lids in there, fishing floats, cigarette lighters. This stuff, and you notice there's a lot of reds. Now, remember I mentioned that reds get consumed. This probably represents well over 5,000 miles of foraging. You know, a trip to the corner for a Happy Meal for a parent albatross is like 5,000 miles. I mean, they're soaring out there with their wings locked, flying at night, going through the entire North Pacific Ocean looking for anything that might be food on the surface of the ocean. They're not divers, they're scavengers. They've got to see it floating, and then they'll go down and get it. Well, what's floating on the ocean now? More than anything else, you can see right there, that's what it is. It's plastic trash. Bottle caps, a big problem. There's the beak of the bird there. This is the stomach cavity. This is a carcass of an albatross chick on Kure Atoll, the northernmost of the Hawaiian Islands. And you can see that these lids are a big problem. Now, I've been told by Silke of Two Hands that her family from Germany sent her a Coke bottle with a leash on the lid. And I've been advocating for years a leash law to keep the lids on bottles so we don't have this issue of albatross consuming plastic on a routine basis, especially these bottle caps. And it seems to me that that fact that this is a routine to have a leash on the lid in Germany means that it's not a technological challenge that can't be overcome to keep the lid on the bottle. The pull tops on beer used to come off, and now we have a pull top on beer that you just crack and it stays on the can. There's no reason why we shouldn't do this with bottles, because you can see that the result is 100,000 of these birds dying, these chicks dying every year with stomachs that look like this. It's just absolutely incredible to think that we're putting these creatures on this plastic diet. They're not going to evolve. A lot of people say, well, can't they tell? I mean, why are they so stupid? But you know what? If someone made a good plastic fake of the fruits that you like to eat and stuck it in with the real fruit, you'd throw a couple of them in your shopping cart as you cruise through the supermarket. Now here's the new poster child for plastic pollution. This is the shearwater. You have a number of species of shearwaters. Mutton birds are just coming back to roost here in Australia right now. They've been foraging up in this garbage patch in the northern hemisphere. Now they're coming back here. 5 years ago, 70% of them had plastic in their stomachs. Now 100% of them have plastic in their stomachs. You may have all seen that special on Lord Howe Island where these necropsies were being performed, finding this incredible amount that Jen Lavers is working on. Well, the reason why I'm saying this may be the new poster child for plastic pollution is the shearwater is the most common seabird in the world. There are millions and millions of these birds. The idea that somehow we could take the most numerous seabird, the most successful flying animal in the ocean, and wipe it out with our trash, to me, is a signal for believing that this problem is urgent, that it needs to be addressed with the kind of urgency that it hasn't been to now. Okay, let's talk a little bit more about other kinds of ingestion. This is a daytime sample. In the ocean, remember I showed you how clear that water was and showed you how the fish had to hide behind this trash? The natural cycle in the ocean is the opposite of the natural cycle on land. On land, your grazers that want to feed on the photosynthetic production come out during the day. Your cows, your goats, they're feeding on the grasses that grow during the day. They go to sleep at night. In the ocean, it's so clear that if they were to do that, to feed on these planktonic organisms, to feed on the photosynthetic plants, the phytoplankton in the ocean during the day, they would easily be chased down and eaten by predators. They have to hide below what's called the photic zone and just come up at night. That's why I say the freaks come out at night in the ocean. There they are. There's the freaky night creatures in the ocean. Here they are laid out in a Pyrex baking dish. And these freaky creatures turn out to be the most numerous fish in the ocean. 55% of fish biomass are these myctophids, the lanternfish. Myctophidae is the most common fish in the ocean. Why? It's not a schooling fish. You can't take it out with nets and turn it into fish meal. It lives its life in darkness, has that big eye right there, and those little photophores right there. Those are lanterns. And the lanternfish turns out to be the feeder fish for all the other fish in the ocean. That's why the salmon leave the rivers. They want to go eat these guys. They're full of oil, they're full of protein. They're just a great food. The seals on Macquarie Island eat them. They're eaten by dolphins. Dolphins herd them and eat them. They are the base of the oceanic food chain. They're coming up to the surface, engaging in this largest daily migration of life on Earth, along with these amphipods and copepods, these little shrimp-like creatures. The shrimp-like creatures process what we call primary production. The photosynthetic plants, the tiny little plants that live in the top of the ocean that were grown during the day, they get scavenged by these little shrimp-like creatures. Then these fish, that's the first part of the ocean food chain, eat those zooplankton, the animal plankton, right? The animal plankton, zooplankton eat the phytoplant plankton, then the fish eat the zooplankton. That's why they're all coming up to the surface at night to have this food feast. Well, we captured 671 of these night feeders in our trawls and started looking at them. We preserved them, took them back to the lab, Our ichthyologist, Christiana Borger, cut them open, slit their stomach right there, and that is a little piece of plastic. Think about it. These guys are accident prone, all right? They're living their lives in darkness. Sun sets, they have to maybe migrate a mile up to the surface. They're busy. I've dove with them. They're darting here, darting there, and they're not leisurely, you know, looking around for something to eat. They're basically in a hurry to get as much into that mouth of theirs as they can between dusk and dawn. What we're finding is they're getting fooled pretty badly by our trash. They're eating a lot of plastic. The nurdles even are part of their diet there. Now, they also have a bigger mouth than they do an anus, and that piece there, it broke when we took it out, but that will go in the mouth and it'll never come out the other end, okay? So that's blocking their digestive system. Then you have this issue of so many pieces of plastic that it acts like a float. You know, imagine trying to swim back down a mile into the ocean with a life jacket on. If you ever tried to dive into a pool with a life vest on, you can't go down very deep. So what are we doing to the most common fish in the ocean that's feeding all the other fish? We're starving it, okay, because there's no nutritive value in this plastic. This plastic is not biodegradable. We're poisoning it. It absorbs pollutants up to 1 million times their level in the surrounding seawater, and we're putting it under stress so it can't dive back down to the ocean. What's that going to do to the seals, the salmon, the swordfish, the tunas that rely on this fish to consume if we make it so they can't reproduce? In order to reproduce, a fish has to put on fat. How is a fish that's put on a plastic diet like this going to put on fat? I don't see that happening. I think this is a very serious threat to the entire oceanic food chain, especially the fish that we like to eat. Take a look at the results. Out of 671 fish, there was 1,391 pieces of plastic, and 35% had an average then of 2 pieces of plastic each in their stomachs. A lot of fish are being fooled. They're eating plastic. Now, where is it on this diagram? You know, we rely on scientists to tell us what's going on. And a lot of times we don't want to do anything unless we get the go-ahead from a scientist. But scientists can't figure out what to do with plastic. Plastic is a predator because it's tangling things up and killing them. Plastic is a prey because things are eating it. But you talk to somebody who's doing, say, the Encyclopedia of Ocean Life, they have no idea where to put plastic in this diagram. It's not alive. I mean, I can understand their problem. Plastic isn't a living thing, so why would we put it in a diagram that purports to show who's eating who in the ocean? So here we have this insult, this enormous insult to the ocean's food web, and nobody's taking it into account in any description of what's being consumed in the ocean. It just goes to show you that you can't rely on science to tell you everything. You've got to err on the safe side. It's not safe to put plastic in the stomachs of everything out in the ocean and not be able to even describe what's happening. All right, so let's talk tsunami. This is what the ocean looked like after that tsunami hit Japan. Look at all that trash. Now, we don't get to blame this on litter bugs. We don't get to blame this on plastic manufacturers. We get to blame this on Mother Nature. This is not, I guess you could call it an act of God. This is not something that we get to lay blame on anyone we can control. So we have to have what Tim talked about, some kind of a response. But there is no response. The world doesn't consider the spill of solid polymer material, basically oil, what I call the solid phase of petroleum, as a problem. We do have responses for the liquid phase of petroleum. When we have the Exxon Valdez or the Deepwater Horizon, we get international cooperation to help clean it up. But we don't get any kind of response when we have an act of God like this. And Dr. Ebbesmeyer says we need to turn that on its head. On a scale of 1 to 10, 10 being worst, he says that an oil spill should be a 3, and a plastic spill should be a 9. Why? Because an oil spill will biodegrade in a matter of decades. A plastic spill goes around polluting, feeding, trapping things for centuries, and there's no response for it. And I can understand the problem. Just like it's hard for a scientist to decide where to put plastic in a food diagram, it's hard for governments to decide how to respond to a solid waste spill. Because why? There's nobody to charge for the cost of the cleanup. It's non-point source pollution. Everybody on the planet has plastic in their lives. Everybody's contributing to plastic. In a tsunami situation, all this stuff is getting out into the ocean, and the only time you could ever do anything about it would be almost immediately after it happens. That's the time you could collect a lot of this debris. Once it's made its way into the deep ocean, collection becomes impossible. These boats and roofs and buoys are on their way, some of them to the Pacific coast of North America, but Dr. Maximenko at Hawaii says 95% of it will never touch land. It's just going to go to this garbage patch out in the middle of the ocean. It's going to sit there and circle around in this gyre, which takes about 6 years to go at one revolution. The period of rotation for the garbage patch is 6 years. Now, Paul went through this in June of this year with a group of scientists on the Sea Dragon. And what they found was a very interesting phenomenon, this voyage they took. Oh, well, first I'm going to show you where this stuff will likely go after 30 years. This is a diagram again by Jim Ingram, the guy who did that sea surface pressure diagram, showing where debris from Japan will end up. And you can see a lot of it will be in this convergent zone with the eastern garbage patch, the western garbage patch, and that sort of highway between them. Most of it will not touch the coast of the United States. So Japan has given $6 million to the governors of Vancouver and Oregon, Washington, and California to deal with this. But who's giving money to deal with the 95% that's going to be in the garbage patch? You know, you look at diagrams like this and you think, well, heck, they can go clean it up. It's that big thing in the middle. We'll just go grab it. The space that this diagram is taking up is enormous. That's why I showed that diagram of the North Pacific Ocean. This is huge. It's like that thing that you're seeing right there is like half as big as the United States of America. So this is the most common fishing buoy I find. This is the black 300 millimeter one. This is the most common glass fishing float I find. And I was filmed by a Korean documentary team, and they sent me their product, their work product, and I was surprised to find out that on the coast of Korea, I could see the origin for the most common glass floats that we find and the most common plastic floats that we find. What would be the reason why on a beach in Korea you would see so many of those floats? Well, guess what? We got ourselves an answer. It is farming. We love farmers, right? We're organic gardeners. We love the fact that we can produce food for ourselves through agriculture. Well, guess what? We've taken so much out of the ocean that it's no longer sufficient for the human population's seafood demand to have wild-caught species. We're having to farm. About 50% of our seafood now is farmed seafood. That seafood has to be produced by the farmers of the sea. The farmers of the sea have an issue. That is, they need to produce like the farmers on land without polluting the surrounding environment. They have standards for nutrient pollution. They have standards for pollution by the feces of the thing that they're growing. But they have standards for bacterial contamination. But no certification organization for mariculture or agriculture has a standard for equipment loss. Now think about a tsunami hitting that vast field of buoys. That's going to tear a lot of them off. It's a new problem that we hadn't thought about, this contamination of the ocean by the farmers of the sea, the modern farmers. So there's a whole suite of issues around who's to blame for plastic pollution of the ocean. Every time I get interviewed, the first question is, well, you've just visited Sydney Harbor. Are we better than, you know, we've been working really hard. Aren't we better than other harbors? You know, and I have to say, well, you're better than Hong Kong, you know. I've just come from Hong Kong. It's terrible. But you've got a big problem. I walked along the shoreline, Manly. I was at down by the bridge, by the Opera House. There's plastic floating all over the surface of Sydney Harbor. There's plastic floating in the ocean around here. There's people carrying throwaway plastic products that miss the bin. I mean, it's just happening. You can't, that's what has prompted Silke and Paul to start the Two Hands Projects, what prompted Tim to start Take 3, is that you can't walk along without seeing some of this errant plastic debris. We have a plastic footprint. It's part of our throwaway society. And so, you know, if you fly into LA airport after a rain, you might see this. If you go to the Citarum River in Indonesia, you might see this. I mean, where's the water in that river? I mean, where are these people supposed to be putting their trash? If that's where it's supposed to be, then it's going to lead out to the river that this tributary goes to. It's going to look like this. And if you think that recycling is the answer, then think again. There's no infrastructure to take back this stuff. If these guys could make money collecting this stuff, they wouldn't be just getting this. They'd be getting all of this stuff and taking it to where they could turn it in for money. This is the only thing they can turn in for money. And those are lightweight, thin plastics. They're going to have to collect a whole lot of them to make a little tiny bit of money. There's just no good recycling infrastructure out there. I mean, I don't care if it's a European country, a wealthy country like the Netherlands, or a poorer country like Mumbai, India, or Cairo, Egypt near the pyramids, or Lagos, Nigeria, or Cook's River right here discharging into Botany Bay. You don't get to be guilt-free in this. Everybody wants to know that they're okay. I'll tell you folks, none of us are okay in this problem. We're sweating our plastics into the environment in our rinse water of our clothes. You might be a greenie that only shops at Patagonia because they're the most green clothing company. Their Patagonia fleece, when you rinse that polyethylene terephthalate, the same stuff that the bottles are made out of, those Dacron polyester fibers bleed about 1,500 fibers into the rinse water every time you do your laundry, and they're being found in sediments worldwide. Nobody's off the hook here. I mean, even the Somali pirate camp looks like a terrible mess, and they're not going to the 7-Eleven, you can bet on that. So let's just assume that the whole world is contributing to this problem equally, and it's going through the coastal zone equally into the ocean. This is a model showing that, done by Dr. Maximenko, Peter Neeler at the University of Hawaii, based on buoys that they deployed out in the ocean. This is how stuff gets distributed around the world ocean as it leaves the coastlines of the world. It begins forming these garbage patches. And remember how we talked about how the equator, hot air rises and gets pushed toward the poles? Well, that's why you don't see a lot of this garbage in the equatorial zone, is because the current is being pushed away from the equatorial zone by the forces of atmospheric the gases of the atmosphere rising and the cooler air rushing in, pushing it either north or south of the equator. So it kind of, if you want to find a clean place in the ocean, probably the best place to look is in the equatorial zone. But the temperate zones where people like to live are filling up with garbage. And those are zones that are highly productive in some cases. In some cases, they're like oceanic deserts. But if you let this diagram go to completion, this is what it looks like. This is the 5 gyres. These are the 40% of the world ocean, corresponding to 25% of the landmass of the entire world, is a floating sea fill. It's the resting place, or not exactly resting, because if you think of a landfill, that's not going anywhere. But these gyres, they move around. These things are collecting our trash, and they're mobile. They have periods of rotation. They're gyres. They go around in a circle. We've been to all of them now. We've had samples from all of them. They're all polluted with plastic, and they all have these myctophids in them. These are those lanternfish you can see. You see? These are very, very common fish. And this habitat is so huge that the most common fish in the ocean you've never eaten, you've probably never heard of it, but it's feeding all the other fish that you do like to eat. Indian Ocean gyre, North Pacific gyre, South Pacific gyre. There's another myctophid. You know, Macquarie Island, hey, the seal scat. Every seal scat on Macquarie Island has myctophid otoliths and pieces of plastic in it. That's what Harry Burton and Cecilia Erickson found and wrote a paper about it. So we've talked about the buoyancy in seawater a little bit. We haven't talked too much about the sinkers. These are the red ones are the ones that float. That's the most common consumer plastics. That's your soap bottles. Your bottle caps are polypropylene. Your soap bottles are polyethylene. And the foamed polystyrene is lighter than water, but the polyethylene terephthalate that the bottle's made out of is heavier. So the bottles, once that cap comes off, they're going to sink. And a good place to study that is in the Mediterranean, because in the Mediterranean you don't need to have a gyre, a convergent zone to accumulate this stuff, because the only exit is right here at the Straits of Gibraltar. So this becomes a repository for trash from Europe and Northern Africa. Well, Dr. Galgani took a submersible out 20 kilometers from the coast, you know, not right near any urban outfall, not right near the mouth of any river, but 20 kilometers from the coast, 1,000 meters deep, you know, that's deep. And that's what he found. We can see the clip of his submersible navigating the bottom of the Mediterranean. Why do I care about that? Because there's creatures that feed on the bottom. This plastic, about 50% of the resins we make are heavier than seawater. There's a whale, there used to be a lot of them, but only the Eastern Pacific gray whale still exists in any number, that feed on the mud at the bottom of the ocean. The mud at the bottom of the ocean is where everything that ever lived and died in the ocean comes to rest. It's like the compost pile at the bottom of the ocean. This animal swims along the mud at the bottom of the ocean, opens its mouth, sluices that mud through its baleen, and extracts the worms and the shrimps that are in the bottom of the ocean. Now what it's getting is our trash that's heavier than seawater. The last bottom-feeding whale in the world. And really, folks, you don't need to be drinking your water out of these bottles. It's not better than water out of the tap. Dr. Sachs, an expert in child and adolescent development, thinks that you're going to get hormone disruption by drinking this kind of water. And he's got scientific proof in the work of Dr. Jörg Ullmann in Germany, who keeps a set of European freshwater snails in very pure water. He divided them in half. He put half of that control group in a bottle of mineral water. They made twice as many eggs as the controls. Just this water that we think is so pure that we drink out of these plastic bottles is bioactive. It's got estrogenic chemicals in it that are capable of activating hormonal systems to produce eggs. This is a serious problem. The fact that we think we're getting clean stuff and we're not. Not only is drinking water out of that bad, but those rings that are on the bottle, if something crawls into it when they're little, they can grow up and look grotesque like this. Or another thing that bottles come in is those six-pack rings. And those things, if something crawls into it, it's very grotesque. Now I have something here that'll bring the issue home. This duck-billed platypus, locally found deceased with that around it. And this is extremely interesting. My host here in Sydney, Karen, is a diver, and she found this shovel-nosed ray with a hairband. This is the typical hairband that people use to put around their ponytails. And she found this shovel-nosed ray right here off Manly Beach, I think it was Cabbage Tree, with this around it, and she removed it. But, you know, it's going to take a while for this to heal, but there it is. This is, so these are, it gets, you know, a lot of times scientists will say, well, this is anecdotal. You just seen one of these things. Well, I'm going around the world, folks. I'm getting these given to me by people everywhere I go, are giving me examples of the harm that plastic pollution is causing. It's getting to be a good deal more than anecdotal. It's simply the way it is right now in the ocean, that things are being changed because of plastic, not in a good way. So remember we talked about how we size class the plastic. Why is this last category always the least common? We think it's because the infinitely small is having an infinitely big influence on the filter feeders in the ocean. These are salps. They're chordate jellies distantly related to humans that are capable of filtering half the water column they inhabit every day. Now, they're not discriminating. Most of the feeding that goes on in the ocean is not discriminatory, where you're looking like the albatross is looking, or you're looking like one of your game fish is looking. You're dealing with a situation in which the feeding is accomplished simply by filtering a lot of seawater. Anything solid in that seawater is assumed to be food, assumed to be biodegradable. That's nature's evolutionary strategy. It makes sense in a historical perspective, but not in a modern world of plastic pollution. They're being given this material as part of their environment. It's a solid, it should be biodegradable, it should be food, but it's not. It's contaminating the ocean food web, and we're seeing it in turtles, with the small plastics blocking the digestive system of turtles. We're seeing it in larger scale here with Silka looking at the stomach contents of a larger turtle, but there's still a lot of small plastics inside of it. And we're seeing it in Velella velella. This is a sailing jellyfish. This is the sail. It floats on the surface of the water. It has a very gelatinous deck. This is the deck of the sailboat of the sailing jellyfish, the by-the-wind sailor, the Velella velella. It bumps into these pieces of plastic floating on the surface of the ocean. It treats it like a pearl in a pearl oyster, where a pearl oyster will take and make a pearl out of a grain of sand by coating it with its body tissue. Here the Velella velella is coating that plastic with its body tissue. So what are we doing? Without any active feeding whatsoever, we're converting the jellyfish of the ocean to plastic. We're making plastic jellyfish with our trash. This is cause for concern. These pollutants that absorb to the plastic, these microparticles are like little poison pills. The pollutants get ingested after the plastic sucks them in like a sponge by zooplankton. Then they become bioavailable to the creatures that eat them, and finally get back to us. That's why what's happening with the Greenland Eskimo is that there are twice as many female babies being born as males, and they have lower birth weight. This is a symptom of those endocrine disrupting pollutants. Their milk is considered toxic. They are not allowed to nurse with natural milk. These are the sentinels of what is going to be happening to us next. We need to take account of it. We can't just say, oh, those are the Eskimos, don't even worry about them. This is a cause for concern for all of us. So that's why I'm saying plastic needs a timeout. That's why I'm having this plastic pollution conversation. If it's on you, it's in you. We need to know what's in that bubble wrap. We need to know what's in that plastic fiber cap. We're not being told what those ingredients are. And science is changing the way we think about pollution. It used to be that, you know, poison was like a bludgeon. You know, you see it in a Shakespeare play, the guy drinks the poison and all of a sudden chokes and keels over dead. Now we're thinking it's more like, not that the dose makes the poison, but it's the timing. A tiny little dose, like the drop of one single drop in a swimming pool, is enough to activate a hormone in a baby that's in development. So it's the timing, and it's not predicted by high-dose studies. So look at where you get these tiny doses. Canned food. The liner is an epoxy that leaches bisphenol A. Bisphenol A was invented to be a natural estrogen substitute. It was given to women to try to prevent miscarriage. Diethylstilbestrol came along and replaced it because it was a stronger estrogen. But plastic manufacturers found out that it would harden plastic. So BPA is made in these hard Nalgene sports bottles to harden them. It's in the epoxy that lines your canned food. Organic peas from the organic store has bisphenol A. Scientists gave the students at Harvard canned soup for a week. Their bisphenol A levels skyrocketed. They took the canned soup away, and the bisphenol A levels came back down. BPA is capable of causing type 2 diabetes. Very low level exposure to BPA for just 4 days causes hyperinsulinemia and insulin resistance in adult mice, which means you take these endocrine disrupting chemicals, put it in their feed, give both mice the exact same diet and exercise, one of them will get twice as fat as the other. So we keep hearing about obesity epidemic, and we have to add a third factor to that equation. It's not just diet and exercise, but also that body burden of chemicals unknown before 1950 that's all part of our bodies now. Canada has already declared bisphenol A a toxic substance. 93% of Canadians test positive for it. And Dr. Von Saal thinks it's part of the reason why we have this global obesity and diabetes epidemic. It's related to the exponential increase in man-made chemicals over the last 2 decades. It also changes behavior. This is kind of fascinating work done by Paola Palanza in Italy. She exposed her lab rats to this bisphenol A and just watched what they did. It turned out mom wasn't such a good mom after being exposed to bisphenol A. She spends more time out of the nest and less time nursing. These green triangles are when they're exposed to bisphenol A. So it's changing the behavior as well as polluting and causing things like diabetes and obesity. It's changing the actual behavior. Now, what if that happened to us? What if this bisphenol A would change the relationship with us with our kids? Dr. Pranskip, quoted in The Realm of Hungry Ghosts by Gabor Mate, says, "It would be disastrous if mothers lost their ability to feel intense gratification from nurturance when children were still quite young." BPA is in all the seafood in Singapore. This chemical that has the potential to do all these nasty things is in all seafood in Singapore, not just fish, but clams, oysters, everything that the scientists looked at, they found BPA in. It's in your cosmetics. Phthalates also. Phthalates are a big deal because they're an anti-androgen, meaning that the male hormone is suppressed by phthalates. They're in your caulking, they're in your makeup. Phthalates is another issue that is intimately related with plastics. And I really have to take a step back when I see these 6-year-olds made up for beauty contests. I'm wondering if mom knows that the chemicals in those makeup potions that she's plastering on her kids are capable of changing their sexual development. A study was done on Puerto Rican girls exposed to these phthalates that are in makeup, and this diethylhexylphthalate caused premature breast development in infants. Girls are becoming women at younger and younger ages. The corresponding thing in males is males are becoming less male. They're being feminized. Dr. Von Saal says we're half the men our fathers were. This thing about low testosterone, inhibition of normal scrotal development. You even get stuff like hypospadias. Hypospadia is where the urine doesn't come out the tip of the penis, it comes out the side. And this testicles in this infant were undescended. This is an anti-androgen doing this, something that's feminizing males in plastics. Phthalates were banned in children's toys in 1999 in the European Union because they're toxic to laboratory animals. Exposure to children was documented, and children are the most sensitive to toxic substances. Also, alternatives were readily available. So we really don't need to expose our children to the chemicals that are in plastics. And we certainly don't want to have a world in which this is the way we're going to have to recreate when we want to get wet. I don't want my kids to have to get wet this way. Now, this leads me to my concluding remarks about the economic system that we live in. It's not doing the job. First of all, it's in crisis. Number one, so it's a great time to think about alternatives. Number two, it's causing a big mess around the world. It makes it hard to recover wasted resources. It makes the necessity of growth in any old junk into a religion. No politician can get elected if he doesn't talk about increasing economic growth, but this economic growth is having very bad consequences for the environment. And the correction can never be just a new technological gizmo. A lot of people think maybe the iPhone 12 will clean up the ocean for us, drive us to the airport, maybe make breakfast, you know. But I don't think the iPhone 12 is going to do that. We're going to have to engage in a struggle with Tim and Paul and the Two Hands Project and the Take 3 Project to get a deposit on bottles here and make people realize that we've got to change the way we do business. We've got to change the attitude about prevention. It's sort of taboo in political circles to talk about the precautionary principle. We want to get products to market in a hurry. If there's a problem, we'll worry about it later. We just need to keep the economy buzzing, keep things humming. And we'll clean it up later. Well, maybe we'll have to have a super fund, but we'll clean it up later. Folks, we can't afford it. We can't clean up the ocean. It's too vast, and we've polluted it too thoroughly. We've got to start thinking about stopping putting stuff in, letting the ocean spit it out on its own. There's a wide range of possible scenarios in which attractive economic, social, and environmental outcomes are possible without relying on economic growth. This is not me saying this. This is a widely respected PhD economist from Canada, Dr. Peter Victor, who wrote a book called Managing Without Growth, Slower by Design, Not Disaster. But look at the implications of managing without growth. The dilemma for policymakers is that the scope of change required for managing without growth is so great that no democratically elected government could implement the requisite policies without the broad-based consent of the electorate. Now, even talking about them could make a politician unelectable. You think if Obama gets up there and says, you know what, I think we can manage pretty well without growing the economy. I think we just need to figure out how to make things better, not just make more of them. Do you think he's going to get elected? That would cause a riot. The Tea Party would go nuts. But you know what? We're going to have to start thinking outside the box. And we're not going to be those people that Bertrand Russell was talking about here back in 1918. We're not going to be the people that just go through life without ever contemplating or criticizing as a whole either their own conditions or those of the world at large. I'm critical of the world at large. I think it's in a big mess. And I think the conditions that caused it need to be changed radically. My goal is self-determination in the sphere of necessary productivity. We've got to have food, shelter, clothing, and energy. Let's do it locally. Let's rely on our own region to produce those things. Create a local stock exchange. Educate people to be politicians, farmers, and scientists in one lifetime. Let's not make it an exclusive club. Dirty jobs can be fun for a while. Get out there in the community garden, get dirty, do some composting. We have to start being thoughtful in our consumption, changing satisfactions, quality not quantity, being for yourself, not being for all this makeup, you know, the boob job, the facelift, that's being for others. Does that make you feel good? No, it makes you sicker in hell, and you got to spend a lot of time in recovery. You need to start thinking about being for yourself, about doing what you can best do for the world. It's not all about trying to please somebody else. So what I do when I'm not sailing is I farm. I do my urban farm, the Gladys Avenue urban farm. I try to get involved in local production of organic produce. I take the excess nutrients from the golf course where I live that go into the lagoon and create that filamentous green algae. I gather it up, put it on my soil, I till it in, I take the compost that I make and some peat moss and a little soil and form it into blocks. I use soil blocks, no plastic pots. You know those roots that circle around in a plastic pot? Those are feeder roots. When you transplant, you get transplant shock. With soil blocks, the roots sense that there's air out there, they stop growing, and you can have intensive urban agriculture with no transplant shock, planting immediately after you harvest. I get cheap farm labor. You definitely got to work on that. You can't do this if you're going to pay an arm and a leg for farm labor. And you got to have quality control. I take a very rigorous attitude towards making sure that no plastic is in any of my produce. We inspect it thoroughly. There you can see my quality control system. And we package it in wooden boxes so that there's no plastic involved. And we take it to a distribution point where Aaliyah Aiden of Beach Greens takes and puts it in a sterilized plastic container that her customers give back to her and get back week after week after week after week. And that way I think we can stop making this our legacy, because I'm ashamed of what we're leaving for the planet. I keep running into 10-year-olds and I tell them, because they're involved in a lot of good projects, I apologize for the mess we're leaving you. So I thank you guys for coming out. I want to make sure that you reduce your plastic footprint, that you engage in this plastic pollution conversation, and that you thank Paul, Silke, and Tim for inviting me here to your wonderful country.